Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is an example to illustrate how to calculate the quartiles and other values using three methods in this case. So I will be using the process by hand that we explained in the presentation, and then I will explain how to use the quartile.inc or quartile inclusive function that is built in Excel. And then I will use the quartile.exc, which is another function built in Excel, and we will compare the information that we have from each one. So let's start the process by hand. First, I need to calculate the minimum. So I will use the minimum function. To select your data, click on the first cell and then hold the shift key and select the last cell, and that should select the entire set of data for you. Now to calculate the quartiles from the process, we know that we should start with the second quartile, which is the median. So that is the median. I will use the median function to calculate that one. Select my data, and then the median is going to be between 32 and 33. That means this divides my data into two sets. This is the lower part of my data, or the numbers that are less than 32.5, and this is the upper part of my data, or the numbers that are bigger than 33. Of course, those numbers have to be arranged in an ascending order before you can proceed. So make sure that you arrange your data. To do that, you're going to select all of your data and then go to the Data tab and then click on this icon, which is sorting from smallest to largest. So that is the first thing that you need to start with. But my data is already sorted. I did not need to do that. Now, the first quartile is the median of the lower half of my data. So that is equal to median. And the lower half of my data is from 20 to 32. The third quartile is the median of the upper half of my data. So I will use the median function, and the upper half of my data is from 33 to 40. And then the maximum, I'm going to use the maximum. The interquartile range is just Q3 minus Q1. The lower fence has the formula Q1 minus 1.5 times the interquartile range, and the upper fence is equal to the third quartile plus 1.5 times the interquartile range. So I calculated all of the values. Now let's go ahead and use the function quartile.inc. The nice thing about this function is you can actually calculate the minimum and maximum using this function. So I'm going to start with the function right here. That is the quartile, and choose the second one, which is inc. It is going to ask you about a range or an array for your data. So by selecting your data, you're going to select the array, and then comma, it's going to ask you which quartile. Since this is the minimum, I will check on the first one. So click the first one. And similar, you're going to do the first quartile. So select your array, and then comma. It's going to ask you about which quartile. You're going to click on the first one and click enter. Select the array, and then comma, and click on number 2 to calculate the second quartile. The third quartile, you're going to use the quartile inc function, and then click on your, select your range, comma, and the third quartile. And for the maximum, select your data, comma, and that is number 4. So select on 4. The interquartile range is just Q3 minus Q1. And the lower fence has the formula Q1. So I'm going to click on Q1 minus 1.5 times the interquartile range. The upper fence has the formula Q3, so I'm going to click on Q3 plus 1.5 times the interquartile range. So in this manner, I calculated all of that. Now let's try the quartile.exc or exclusive. The minimum, I can't calculate that using the quartile.exc, so I'm going to use the minimum function for that. The first quartile, I can calculate that using the quartile EXC, comma, and choose the first one. As you can see, I only have 3 options. I can calculate the maximum and minimum using this function. Then the third quartile is similar. And then the maximum, I'll use the function max to find the maximum for my data. And the interquartile range is just the third quartile minus the first quartile. The upper fence has the formula, the first quartile, so that is Q1 minus 1.5 times the interquartile range. And the upper fence has the formula Q3 plus 1.5 times the interquartile range. Let's now compare the values that we got from each function and from the process that we did by hand. So as you can see, the process that we did by hand matches what we learned in the presentation. It's not a big deal since the difference is not going to be huge. So as you can notice here, the first quartile using the quartile inclusive, the difference is just a quarter. And the second quartile is the same for all of them. And the third quartile is less than the actual value by 1/2. The interquartile range is less than the actual value by 0.75. And the upper fence and the lower fence are a little bit different. I will go with the quartile.inc when calculating those values instead of going with the quartile EXC, since I have the benefit of calculating the maximum and minimum from here, and the difference is not that big difference. So I hope that helped you, and I will see you in class.